Anin everyone. Kimigwich, Iwagu, Gamijion, Ugijagad, Kimigwich, Iwagu, Gamijion, Ziibiwing. Welcome to our Songs Came Through, a reading from the Norton Anthology of Poets of Native Nations. My name is Gordon Henry. I'm a professor in the English department at MSU. I want to thank my colleagues in the English department and the students we all work with for all they do to make our work fulfilling and inspiring. Thank you all for joining us as well. Remember, you are in Indian country almost everywhere you go in this land, everywhere you go in this land. This event is sponsored by the Audrey and John Leslie Endowment, Ziibiwing Center for Anishinaabe Culture and Lifeways, the Native American Institute, and the Creative Writing Program in the English department at MSU. I want to thank my Zoom co-host as well, Christy Poitra, from the director of the Native American Institute at MSU, and Ellie Mitchell, who is the Indigenous Language Coordinator. They're here to help us with things out. I will turn things over now to the moderator, Jennifer Foerster, just to read a brief biography from her. Jennifer Foerster is Mvskoke, the author of 2 collections of poetry, Leaving Tulsa and Bright Raft in the Afterweather. She's a graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. She received her PhD from the University of Denver and was a Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford, and has received grants and fellowships from the Lannan Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. And I want to congratulate her for the work she's done on the anthology. She did a tremendous amount of the heavy lifting for us, and appreciate her. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Gordon. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And thank you to MSU for hosting this event. Last night was excellent. If some of you were able to chime in, it was really enjoyable to listen to the readers. So thanks Michigan State for bringing this together and inviting us for these 2 events. This is an amazing collaboration, this anthology, and it was such an honor and pleasure to work with all the poets in the anthology and the contributing editors, and Leanne Howe and Joy Harjo, the 2 editors of the anthology. It was really a tremendous undertaking to put together this, how many hundreds of pages that this anthology is, and so many different tribal nations represented and poets spanning over 3 centuries. Those that we included and those that aren't included are all still in this anthology together, I think, in terms of a collective voice. It was really difficult choices. There are so many poems and people that we wanted to include, and we simply couldn't because of page limits. So we really hope that this anthology is an open door to just begin your reading and exploration of poems and poets of Native nations of this nation. And so I'm really thrilled today to read with several of the poets in the anthology, Tenea Winder, Mark Turcotte, and Cedar Sigo. And each one of us will read a little bit, and I'll introduce every reader right before they read. But I thought I would open with a poem from the anthology from an Anishinaabe poet, Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. She is one of my favorite poets because, well, I've done a lot of reading of her work. She was really a little known poet. She started writing in the early 1800s, which is really remarkable. And she wrote in Anishinaabe, Moine, and English. Her mother, an Ojibwe mother, and a Scots-Irish father. And so she grew up writing and reading and speaking in both Ojibwe and English. And her work, she ended up marrying the very famous person, Henry Schoolcraft. See, I'm so glad I remember her name and not his. He was one of the earliest ethnologists, and a lot of his knowledge came from her and her family. But as a result, her work was really forgotten and hidden away until recently with Robert Dale Parker's book, The Sound the Stars Make Rushing Through the Sky, which is a collection of Jane Johnston Schoolcraft's poems. And he wrote this after finding a box of her work kind of tucked away. So thanks to him, we're able to receive a lot of her work, which was written, several hundred years ago. So I'm gonna just read one of her poems, To the Pine Tree. And one of the other reason I wanted to read this is that it's an example in the book of trying to provide the poem in English and in Anishinaabe, so showing the language, the different languages. So this poem she wrote in both languages, and I'm going to read the one that she wrote in English, and the one in the anthology that's also in Anishinaabe was translated by Margaret Newden, who read last night. So we have, in a way, 3 different voices in this poem of, her Anishinaabe voice, her English voice, and a current Anishinaabe translator voice. This is called To the Pine Tree. Also, one back note about this poem is she was sent to boarding school in England when she was a little girl and wasn't very well there and got pretty sick. So she came home, and this poem reflects on her return to her homelands. The pine, I eager cried. The pine, my father, see it stand as first that cherished tree I spied, returning to my native land. The pine, oh lovely scene, the pine that is forever green. Oh beauteous tree, happy sight, that greets me on my native strand and hails me with a friend's delight to my own dear bright motherland. Oh, 'tis to me a heart-sweet scene, the pine that's evergreen. Not all the trees of England bright, not Erin's lawns of green and light, are half so sweet to memory's eye as this dear type of northern sky. Oh, 'tis to me a heart-sweet scene, the pine that evergreen. So hopefully you all have a chance to take a look at the anthology and can read this poem in its several versions in Anishinaabe and in her different versions of English and Meg Newton's translation. And then I'll just read one of my poems and then we can hear from Tenea. So I'll read one of the poems that's also in the anthology here that, now that I think about it, is someone and speaks to that poem of Jane Johnston Schoolcraft's about returning home. And I didn't introduce myself fully, but my mother's family is Mvskoke from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I was living in New Mexico for a long time, and I would drive back and forth to Tulsa to visit my grandparents. And this poem came out of it, and it's called Leaving Tulsa, and it's really about the fact that I felt like I was always having to leave home and dealing with what it is to return home. I also grew up living mostly in Europe because my father was in the military. So that sense of coming and going from home was really prevalent in this early book. Leaving Tulsa. Once there were coyotes, cardinals in the cedar. You could cure amnesia with the trees of our back 40. Once I drowned in a monsoon of frogs. Grandma said it was a good thing, a promise for a good crop. Grandma's perfect tomatoes, squash. She taught us to shuck corn, laughing, never spoke about her childhood or the faces in the gingerbread tins stacked in the closet. She was covered in a quilt, the creek way, but I don't know this kind of burial. Vanishing toads, thinning pecan groves, peach trees choked by palms. New neighbors tossing clipped grass over our fence line, griping to the city of our overgrown fields. Grandma fell in love with a truck driver, grew watermelons by the pond on our Indian allotment, took us fishing for dragonflies. When the bulldozers came with their documents from the city and a truckload of pipelines, her shotgun was already loaded. Under the bent chestnut, the well where Cosetta's husband hid his whiskey, buried beneath her bundle of beads, they tell the story of our family, Cosetta's land flattened to a parking lot. Grandma potted a cedar sapling I could take on the road for luck. She used the bark for heart lesions doctors couldn't explain. To her, they were maps, traces of home, the Milky Way, where she's going, she said. After the funeral, I stowed her jewelry in the ground, promised to return when the rivers rose. On the grassy plain behind the house, one buffalo remains. Along the highway's gravel pits, sunflowers stand in dense rows. Telephone poles crook into the layered sky, a crow's beak broken by a windmill's blade. It is then I understand my grandmother. When they see open land, they only know to take it. I understand how to walk among hay bales looking for turtle shells, how to sing over the groan of the county road widening to 4 lanes. I understand how to keep from looking up. Small planes trail overhead as I kneel in the Johnson grass, combing away footprints. Up here, parallel to the median, with a vista of mesas weavings, the sky a belt of blue and white beadwork, I see our 160 acres stamped on God's forsaken country, a roof blown off a shed, beams bent like matchsticks, a drove of white cows making their home in a derailed train car. Thank you so much. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our next reader, Tenea Winder, who I'll read her bio from the anthology, but just to say she is an incredible poet and speaker and organizer. She does tremendous work with Native youth and so many people for music and literature. So I'm just grateful for all the hard work that she does in the world. Tenea Winder is Duckwater, Shoshone, Southern Ute, and Pyramid Lake Paiute. Grew up in Ignacio, Colorado, on the Southern Ute Reservation. She received her BA in English from Stanford University and her MFA from the University of New Mexico. Her debut poetry collection, Words Like Love, was published in 2015, followed by Why Storms Are Named After People and Bullets Remain Nameless in 2017. She co-founded As Us, a space for women of the world, a magazine focused on publishing works by underrepresented writers, and she founded Dream Warriors, an Indigenous artist management company. She has taught at the University of Colorado Boulder, Stanford University, and the University of New Mexico, and is the director of the University of Colorado Boulder's Upward Bound program. Please welcome Tenea Winder.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And it was lovely to hear you read. It helped ground me. I'm going to start my session with reading another poem from the anthology by Linda Hogan. I was actually first introduced to her work later in life. Like my high school, we only had to read 2 books to graduate, and one was Bless Me Ultima, which was awesome, and the other one was like a Shakespeare play. So it took me a long time to find Native literature because Stanford was very whitewashed in the English department, and it wasn't until I took classes in the drama department with Shay Moraga that I actually got to read Joy's work and Linda Hogan's work, and we read The Woman Who Watches Over the World, and it just really impacted me at my core. It's what got me into doing Writing to Heal workshops for myself and for youth. So I wanted to read this poem by Linda Hogan. It's in the anthology. It's called The History of Fire. My mother is a fire beneath stone, my father, lava. My grandmother is a match, my sister, straw. Grandfather is kindling like trees of the world. My brothers are gunpowder, and I am smoke with gray hair, ash with black fingers and palms. I am wind for the fire. My dear one is a jar of burned bones I have saved. This is where our living goes, and still we breathe, and even the dry grass with sun and lightning above it has no choice but to grow, and then lie down, with no other end in sight. Air is between these words, fanning the flame. And I love that poem, and I love the way that we write about our loved ones and our families. And I also just really love fire because it's used for so many different things, you know, like ceremony or bringing people together, food, keeping loved ones warm. So it's just an image and a metaphor that always sticks with me. And so the next poem I'm going to read is one of mine from the anthology. It's written just with my grandmother in mind, with thinking about all the times I've tried to learn Shoshone from her. I hope to one day also write poems that can be translated into the different nations I carry inside of me. And so this one's from my grandmother. Anytime I do a reading, I always like to share this one. And she recently passed away a couple weeks ago, so it just even means so much more now. It's called Learning to Say I Love You. My favorite conversations are with my grandmother while she teaches me words in Indian, as she says. I ask, how do you say, where did you go? And where are you going? Questions that layer my tongue in ash, reminding me of fire, the taste. Each time I speak, the slow burn of every loss I have witnessed cracks my lips. Go and going, axe singed into my bones, so I ask, teach me I'm coming with you. So it sits rock heavy in my mouth, because my tongue is at war with history. Boarding school, kill the Indian, save the man, acts of colonization, strain pronunciation when I want to say, take me with you. It dissolves before I can stomach the sweetness of language hours. I am losing. I am lost, lodged somewhere in my throat between decades of broken syllables. Teach me how to reach the ones who are born already running. Teach me how to talk to the ones who need it most. Dear universe, gift me words that linger softly like dusk. There must be a phrase to contain wherever you go, whether or not you know where you've been or where you are going. And, just as somebody who's been impacted by loss, as we all have, nobody lives life without feeling that loss. Those are just questions I feel like I want to answer in any art form, where did you go, where are you going, wishing what you could take, that they could take parts of you with them, or parts of you can stay. And I'm really grateful that this poem in particular is in this anthology, because just that concept, when the light of the world was subdued, our songs came through. When you're pushed to your breaking point, what happens, what can you transform into? And I'm working on my next book, which is actually about my grandmother, but now with her gone, it's probably going to change a little bit. But it's called When Stars Fall from the Sky, and it will come out through University of New Mexico Press. But that's kind of like this, it makes me think of this title, when the light of the world, our songs came through. And so when stars fall from the sky, when you feel like your world is ending, what comes through? So I'm actually going to end with sharing a song. Gordon was asking me earlier if I brought my guitar. I did not, but I have a song I'm going to share with you guys, because for me, that's what it is, learning from Joy and seeing her blend poetry and music and performance. And my grandmother, one of her favorite stories to tell is when she was in boarding school, she won this talent show contest singing Blue Moon. And I remember when I first started playing guitar, I was thinking, I wonder who I got my voice from. And she was like, you got it from me. I'm telling you, I've sang. And so I've always said, anytime I'm able to share my voice, whether in poetry or song, it's from my grandma. And I feel confident enough to break into that realm now because of people like Joy laying the foundation. So I'm going to share this song. I actually wrote it for my partner, but I think it just can apply to anybody you love. And it's called Thanks for Loving Me. So I'm going to share my screen and play it for you guys real quick. And then that will be me. You told me I was brave, even when I felt afraid. Told me to stand tall, get back up when I fall. And I just wanted to say to you, thanks for loving me too. Thanks for loving me. Thanks for loving me. Thanks for loving me too. Never thought I'd find the one I want for life.
someone with wounds that matched mine. Never known a feeling quite this strong. Finally found where I belong. And I just wanted to say to you, thanks for loving me too. Thanks for loving me. Thanks for loving me. Thanks for loving me too. And I love you more each breath I take. This heart beats for you. And I'll find you in every lifetime. I know this much to be true. And I wanted to say to you, thanks for loving me too. Thanks for loving me. Thanks for loving me. Thanks for loving me too.
So Twayak, thank you for letting me share, and I will pass it off to Jennifer again.
Thank you so much, Tanaya. So beautiful. That song is absolutely gorgeous. I really hope it gets recorded so I can listen to it regularly. It's very beautiful. I'm so impressed with your work in all of its forms. So thank you for sharing. And I really look forward to your book. That's great news. When is it coming out?
I don't know. I have to submit the manuscript by the end of June, so hopefully I can make that deadline, and then it's in their hands after that.
Excellent. I'm so excited. Well, we all look forward to it. So I'm thrilled now to introduce Mark Turcotte, who I'm meeting for the first time right now. We've met over email, but it's great to finally meet Mark virtually. I've been a fan of Mark's poems for a long time. So I'm so happy that he's, of course, in the anthology, and also that we get to hear from him today. Mark Turcotte is Anishinaabe Turtle Mountain Band, grew up in North Dakota on the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and later in Lansing, Michigan. Turcotte won the first Gwendolyn Brooks Open Mic Award, and the Wisconsin Arts Board named him a literary fellow in 1999 and 2003. He has published 4 books of poetry, including Exploding Chippewas from Northwestern University Press in 2002, Le Chant de la Route, I hope I pronounced that okay, from Vague Vert Editions 2001, and The Feathered Heart, Michigan State University Press, revised in 1998. He has received awards from the Lannan Foundation, the WordCraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers, and the Wisconsin Arts Board. He lives and works in Chicago. And he just told us this morning, well, it's morning here in California, that Monday his poem will be on Poem a Day. So if any of you have not yet subscribed to Poem a Day from the Poetry Foundation, do so. And you'll get to read one of his poems on Monday. And I think Gordon Henry has a poem as well coming up there. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome Mark Turcotte. You have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. I'm an expert at technology. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tanaya. That was lovely. You are all very lucky that I did not bring my guitar today. That's all I can say. Although I see Gordon has one back there. Maybe he could just like improvise behind me. But I did bring my bongos. Not everybody knows that I accompany myself on bongos. So we'll see if I get nerve enough to do that. I don't really do that. I'm kidding. I need to start by thanking Joy and Leanne and all the assistant and subsidiary editors of this book. I understand it was a tremendous process, a really deep process. I noticed in Joy's introduction, she mentions that as sort of a final step in editing, I guess she and some other people got together and read the entire thing out loud. Does that sound familiar, Jennifer? Yeah. Which seems to me like the perfect way to do it. And I really want to emphasize this point, is that this is an anthology that was edited by Native people. And a lot of what Native artists do, no matter what their art is spend a little bit of time speaking back to a lot of ill-informed, ill-defined, incorrect, wrong, sometimes malicious, sometimes not, art that has been made on our behalves, writing, visual arts. And so it's really important that, to say it bluntly, that Native people had command of this anthology. And I think it makes all the difference in the world, from everything about the way it was collected, everything about the way it was edited, the way it was shaped. The formatting of the book is special. It's very much related to nativeness. So I just want to make sure people know that. And I also need to pay a little bit of respects to East Lansing, Michigan today. In my bio, it mentions that I grew up at Turtle Mountain. I didn't really grow up at Turtle Mountain. I was born in Lansing, and very soon after I was born, my Turtle Mountain father took me and my mother and my sister out to Turtle Mountain. And so then I grew up from there. And then, but not all my growing up. I spent the second part of my growing up in and around Lansing. And I spent quite a bit of time in my early 20s in East Lansing on Kedzie Avenue, right where it runs into Grand River. There's still a house there. And as a matter of fact, this Picasso behind me on the wall, I got that for my 16th birthday from Jacundry Bookstore. You remember Jacundry's, Gordon? Yeah. It was a great bookstore, the first bookstore that really had things on the shelves that just fascinated me, compared to going to Walden's at the mall or something like that, back in those days. Anyway, so I have that East Lansing connection. I lived in that house there for a few years, and we used to go en masse, me and all the people living in the house, dancing to all the punk rock bands that were passing through town. And so I feel a real affinity to the area. So I'm going to start with my couple of short little poems, one of which actually is about a moment in East Lansing. But first, Battlefield, and it's for my sister, Jackie Sue, who is no longer here for this. Battlefield. Back when I used to be Indian, I am standing outside the pool hall with my sister, she, strawberry blonde. Stale sweat and beer through the open door. A warrior leans on his stick, fingers blue with chalk. Another bends to shoot. His braids brush the green felt, swinging to the beat of the jukebox. We move away. Hank Williams falls again in the back seat of a Cadillac. I look back. A wind off the distant hills lifts my shirt, brings the scent of wounded horses. This is called Burn. And it's about one of those nights of me dancing with like the 4 or 5 women that I lived in a house with at a crazy punk club in East Lansing. Burn. Back when I used to be Indian, I am crushing the dance floor, jump boots thumping, Johnny Rotten, red lights, blue bang in my eyes. The white girl watching does not know why, and it doesn't matter. I spin, eat I don't care for breakfast, so what for lunch? She moves to me, dark gaze, tongue hot to lips. The music is hard, the lights louder. She slides slow against my hip to hiss, go, go, Geronimo. I stop. All silence, he sits beside the fire at the center of the floor, hands sifting through the ashes, mouth moving in the shape of my name. I turn to reach toward him, take one step, feel my skin begin to flame away. I was saying yesterday when we did one of these virtual reads that I'm curious to know how they chose the poems they chose. And I'm guessing that it's because we have Hank Williams and Johnny Rotten and Geronimo in these poems, some all great musicians. Anyway, so with that in mind, sad to hear recently that just the other day that an old friend of mine from East Lansing, I knew him well back in the day, as they say, passed away about 10 days ago. And we'd lost touch, but I immediately was rushed, was filled with lots of memories of him. So I'm going to read this poem by Linda Noel. It's called Lesson in Fire, and I'm going to read it for Bob Barnhart, who is now in the swoon, because he made and tended good fires. Lesson in Fire. He built a good fire. He taught me to tend the fire, how to make it stand so it could breathe, and how the flames create coals that turn into faces or eyes of fish swimming out of flames into gray rivers of ash, and how the eyes and faces look out at us, burn up for us to heat the air that we breathe, and so into us we swallow all the shapes created in a well-tended fire. That was a new poem for me. One of the things that I noticed, I discovered a lot of poems that I hadn't heard of before, and that was wonderful aspect of this book. Here's another one of those by Vince Wanase, Forgotten Coyote Stories. A long time ago, when I was a kid, I lived with my uncle and aunt. My uncle rode with Joseph when he was a kid. I mean, my uncle, not Joseph. Uncle used to tell us kids coyote stories. Some were funny, some weren't. My mother took us from uncle and aunt. She put us in a Catholic boarding school. At school, I told some of the coyote stories. The sister said, "Don't believe those stories. Believe us." About a guy who waves a stick and the sea opens, walks on water, who dies and comes back to life again, who ascends up into the sky. I used to believe all of those stories. I don't anymore. Now I wish I could remember those coyote stories Uncle told me. And I'm going to read something by my friend Heid Erdrich, a poem that's in the book. But it's a poem, like I was saying, that is speaking back to something else that was written, if you'll indulge me. In 1961, when John F. Kennedy was inaugurated to the presidency, I was a child, but I heard about this all the time while I was growing up, just about that. Robert Frost read a poem at the inauguration that, if carefully listened to, was fairly insulting to Native people. And it was disappointing to a lot of my elders because they were really counting on John Kennedy to be a different sort of president for Native people. And there on the first moment of his inauguration, they were dispirited. His poem was called The Gift Outright. And then I'll read Hyde's response to his poem. The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by, possessed by what we now no more possessed. Something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war. To the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced. Such as she was, such as she would become. Hyde's poem is called The Theft Outright. It's a nice mix of humor and venom. We were the land's before we were. Or the land was ours before we were a land. Or this land was our land, it was not your land. We were the land before we were people, loamy roamers rising, so the stories go, or formed of clay, spit into with breath reeking soul. What's America but the legend of rock and roll? Red rocks, blood clots bearing boys, blood sands swimming being from women's hands. We originally spontaneous as hemorrhage. Unpossessing of what we still are possessed by what we now no more possess. We were the land before we were people, dreamy sunbeams where sun don't shine, so the story goes, or pulled up a hole, clawing past ants and roots. Diné in documentaries scoff DNA evidence off. They landed late, but canyons spoke them home. Nomadic Turkish horse tribes, they don't know. What's America but the legend of stop and go? Could be cousins left on the land bridge. Contrary to popular belief, that was a two-way toll. In any case, we'd claim them, give them some place to stay. Such as we were, we gave most things outright. The deed of the theft was many deeds and leases and claim stakes and tenure disputes and moved plat markers stolen still today. We were the land before we were a people, earth divers, her darling mud puppies, so the story goes, or emerging, fully forming from flesh of earth. The land, not the least vaguely, realizing in all four directions, still storied, art-filled, fully enhanced, such as she is, such as she wills us to become. That's Hyde Erdrich, The Theft Outright, from the Anthology. And rather than doing another poem, I just want to mention, often reactions that I get from non-Native people to that sort of moment in our work, they often, bring up this idea of, well, that frost thing was a long time ago, and just to make my point more fine, it was just less than 10 years ago that I heard a person in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a non-Native writer, a very accomplished, famous writer, as a matter of fact, stand on a stage and say, every time I come to New Mexico, I imagine what it was like when the first people came here and they realized that there were no stories. There was no art, there was nothing here before them. And she was referring to settlers. And I thought, that sounds just like frost, And so it isn't old. It isn't old. It's old, it's recent, it's yesterday. Unfortunately, probably tomorrow. But I'm really glad to be here and share with everybody. It always feels so familiar to hear everybody read. So thanks so much, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Mark. It was excellent, excellent reading. And I'm so glad to hear those poems that you pulled out from the anthology. Just a reminder of how much richness is in this anthology, and also it's in this very vast universe of so many poets with timeless, I won't even say thousands, timeless years old stories that have been always and are still here and will always be this land. So thank you for that reminder. I'm pleased to introduce Cedar Sigo next. Cedar is also a wonderful poet and a wonderful friend. Cedar lives now in Lowell, Washington, but I met him when he lived here in San Francisco, where I'm living. And we had some wonderful times together, talking about poetry, talking about music, writing together, taking long walks through the city. So Cedar Sigo is Suquamish. His published works include Stranger in Town, Language Arts, most recently Royals in 2017 from Wave Books. He's also the editor of There You Are, Interviews, Journals, and Ephemera by Joanne Kiger, also from Wave in 2017. He has several other books, including some that from his own press imprint. Some of his other books include Selected Writings, Ugly Duckling Press, and Expensive Magic, House Press 2008. He now lives in Lowell, Washington, and I'm very excited because he's putting together some remarkable essays that we'll soon hopefully have in this world to read. He's also a great accomplished essayist. Please welcome Cedar Sigo.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. And I want to say thank you to Gordon for including me here, and also to my co-readers today. This is my first event that I've gotten to do for the Norton, and we worked on it for so long. And so I'm just very excited to be here and really happy to read from it. And I wanted to start with just a little paragraph from Joy's introduction that I value so much. And it's just this. Our existence as sentient human beings in the establishment of this country was denied. Our presence is still an afterthought and fraught with tension, because our continued presence means that the mythic storyline of the founding of this country is inaccurate. The United States is a very young country and has been in existence for only a few hundred years. Indigenous peoples have been here for thousands upon thousands of years, and we are still here. I just find that very powerful, and I feel like what I learned from doing this anthology is that I can speak for more than myself, and I feel like that paragraph of Joy's. I mean, she's really speaking for me. So in that spirit, I will read a couple poems by other poets in here, starting with Dwayne Nyadam, who is a Jonestown slalom, and that band is just over the bridge from where I am right now, just over Hood Canal. And I don't know, I just love his approach to handling the landscape of this area, which I'm so familiar with. He doesn't try to do it in some orderly, vast, bird's eye view kind of way. It's just all crammed together like it is on Earth, and I appreciate that. It's called Center Moon's Little Brother. I camp in the light of the fox, within the singing mirror of night. Hunt for courage to return to the voice, whirling my failures through the meadow, where I watch my childhood pick choke cherries, the women cook salmon on the beach. My grandfather sings his song to deer. When my heart centers inside the necklace of fires surrounding his village of white fur, sleeping under 7 snowy blankets of changes, I will leave Raven's Cave. And another masterpiece in here, and this one's by D.G. Okpik, an Inupiat writer and dear friend. And I don't know, I think this is from Corpse Whale, but the title is The Fate of the Inupiat Like Kingfisher. But no one can stop a bird spear set in motion, made of notched bone, feathered arrows pinnate around the shaft, with hair fringe as it strikes piercing, depilated skin. Some humans weave themselves with lime grass into large orbs. Others make goose feet baskets of seaweed or with narrow leaves, or collect matches or tobacco. The lamp soot burns like gas. On Clovis foot, a circular icy reef, my existence becoming a flicker. Like the orange scales of a kingfisher, we pirouette, diving, diving deep. And I'll read, I have 2 sort of sonnet length pieces in the anthology, and I'll read those. And they're from a book called Language Arts from 2014. A small secluded valley. Your portraits are all thin Indians, half their faces edging out the fog. Where sparks rain onto our temple, where I enter to write the names of my poems for the night. Daybreak Star and the Sun, both of which I never got around to, for want of love and allegiance in every second. My regrets you interrupted, offset in the kind light as a crown. Evans walking around, sounds behind a closed door. Nice to see you, to walk a bit and stop, as on a river, its lava shut under in a tunnel of love. Regardless, the visions hike up overnight and flames trail off like the finest spider's thread, slipping my mind. This whole book has a kind of sonnet sequence running through the middle of it. And this is another of those, also in the anthology, titled After Self-Help. It should be titled After a Bad Breakup. All my rooms are alien. Towers of books tilt and crumble at the least extended breath. A matinee beyond recall. Brown birds pale-breasted darting through. Too late, hello, later. Kiss the lights and they change out over the stardust. Cities are huge machines for sorting poets, skating down the cellophane and folded hills. Even cast-off lines have their own pull and rhyme. Man at leisure, ripped out of my mind. Lonesome after mine own kind. Hot black, soft white, warm reds. Mine a thinking man's cartoon western. Mine the one who enters the stories. Mine the evergreen tears brushed with coral. The boat in the box is mine, and mine the full sky. And I'll read two more poems. This is sort of a native classic in my own mind, titled Things to Do in Suquamish. And I just sort of jacked this form from the poet Ted Berrigan, who did a lot of Things to Do poems. He did Things to Do in New York City, Things to Do in Bolinas, Things to Do on Speed. And I decided to do Things to Do in Suquamish just to tweak the form, reservation style. So Things to Do in Suquamish. Smoke salmon. Call San Francisco, like totally. Get driven to the terminal. Escape. Come back after dark and feed the horses. Alfalfa, Timothy, oats. Pick their hooves. Visit the Suquamish Museum. The eyes of Chief Seattle are shut, his spirit to himself. Sepia tones, baskets, white hot rocks, cobalt trade beads. Say hi to all my cousins. Cul-de-sac. Hi, Josh. Hi, Jeremy. Drink Rainier beer. A red ribbon out, up, and over the peak. I confuse it with Mount Fuji. Walk back to Dad's room. He talks when he wants and smokes. Linger over his bookshelf. Moby Dick, Starling Street, all of Kurt Vonnegut. Try and write the serial killer light at night. See through, green and black. Give up, try prose. And I'll read one more poem. And this is from a different book called Royals. And it's kind of hard to write about the landscape around here because of the sort of the crush I was describing. And this is the one time I think it's remotely correct. But this was when we went camping up in Port Angeles, which is a little north of here. In and around Port Angeles. Crescent was the lake, and Air Crest a motel, mind stuck at my sources. A flimsy strip of rooms painted, spotless insides. A blossom curled to its drink in the glass jar. Fluid as past saviors and poet explorers. Philip with the shade of Miss Kids. Any rough land rises with light. A peeling red house, rotten wood trim. It felt empty from across the river. I was a giant bent at the waist with massive reach through lines of rain, combing knots from the fog, clear down through the pine. Tiny points of bloody lime ink rejoined every image, meaning light pressed the day long, menacing cord, congested hall of mosses, bump and narrow bridge. I fell out alone and so solid, reciting my crystalline little head off in slick and banded verse. Oh, the air from the valve that burns, which glyph? Thank you.
Thank you. So beautiful, Cedar. Love those poems. It's wonderful to hear. I thought I'd maybe just read one poem in closing, and then if people have some questions, we could do a little Q&A, and please put them in the chat box if you have them. Does that sound good? Okay. So I wanted to close with this poem by Sally Benedict, who was Akwesasne Mohawk. She did a lot of work with children's literature. She illustrated and wrote children's books. She also headed the Aboriginal Rights and Research Office for the Mohawk Council of the Akwesasne. So just thinking about the ways that so many poets in this anthology serve their communities and their people, in addition to writing. And this poem I want to read because it gives me a lot of peace, remembering how surrounded we all are how surrounded we are by beauty in this life and beyond. So this is called Sweetgrass is Around Her. A woman was sitting on a rock. I could see her clearly, even though she was far away. She was Teo Hontasen, my mother's aunt. She was a basket maker. When I was young, my mother told me that her name meant sweet grass is all around her. I thought that it was a good name for a basket maker. She was in her 80s then. She was short like me and a bit stout. She knew the land well, and the plants and the medicines and the seasons. She knew how to talk to the Creator too, and the thunderers and the rainmakers. She had a big bundle of sweetgrass at her side. It was long and green and shiny. Her big straw hat shaded her round face. It was very hot. She pulled her mid-calf length dress down to her ankles over her rubber boots. She brought her lunch in a paper bag, a canning jar of cold tea, fried bread, sliced meat, and some butter wrapped in tinfoil. She placed them carefully on the rock. She reached into the bag and pulled out a can of soft drink. I thought it strange. She didn't drink soft drinks. Then she reached for her pocket knife. Basket makers always have a good knife. It was in the pocket of the full-length canvas apron that was always safety pinned to her dress. She made 2 sandwiches, looked around, saw me looking at her. Her eyes sparkled and smiled. She lifted up the soft drink and signaled me to come. After we ate, she stood up on the rock and looked out. She smelled the air. I knew that she could smell the sweet grass. I never could. She pointed to very swampy land. Mosquitoes, I thought. I was dressed poorly. We didn't talk much, but we could hear and listen to each other. She never forced me to speak Mohawk. Mohawk with an English accent made her laugh. She didn't want to hear English, though. We would spend all day picking sweetgrass. Sometimes we would look for medicines. One time, my mother asked her what she thought heaven would be like. She said that there was sweetgrass everywhere, and people made the most beautiful baskets. So with that, thank you so much, Cedar, Tenea, Mark, for a beautiful reading. Thank you so much, Gordon, for bringing us together, and Michigan State University for hosting us as we celebrate this anthology.
Certainly, Jennifer. Thanks everyone. Great reading, and your commentary and your thoughts on the poetry in the anthology are really helpful. If there's any questions out there from the people that are participating or attendees to the meeting, please forward them now, or otherwise you might lose the opportunity to ask those questions. Or if the panelists have questions for each other or comments, that would work for me as well.
I notice we have some lookers, but no talkers.
Yeah. That's that could
There's
be
one.
good.
There's one question I hear to Cedar. What was the name of the post-breakup poem?
Right. Yeah, the real name for that is it's called After Self-Help, and it's in the anthology. And then otherwise it's in this book by Wave called Language Arts. Yeah.
Excellent. Anyone else? Comments or questions?
Well, I wanted to mention that Cedar's poem about Suquamish, I will now consider that an iconic Native poem, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've used that poem in a lot of classes as a teaching poem, because it's such a great form to play with. Like Cedar said, he borrowed it from the Ted Berrigan Things to Do. And so I'll often show students that one and say, okay, write a things to do poem, things to do in whatever, in your place of home. Or so it's
yeah,
a great.
Weirdly, that I actually wrote that in my own workshop in Seattle. Like I wrote it in my own panic, of having to write, within my own workshop. So it's actual propaganda.
So we do have another question from Christy to all panelists. Does reading your work bring you back to the time in your life when you wrote it? Anybody want to take that one on?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, sometimes the pieces I wrote them when they happened. So, it's like a double return on them or something, I tend not to write about anything that I haven't experienced or witnessed or, myself. I try not to speak for other people, persona poetry and stuff. So everything I write has some sort of quasi-autobiographical connection, to my life. I mean, I've written a couple poems based on stories that people told me, in great detail, and that I had permission to sort of use in my work. But yeah, absolutely. And I don't even think about it until later, like when somebody asks about it, But yeah, certainly all those smells, every once in a while you start getting all misty about something you're reading, and you realize it's because you're there,
Yeah, I would say similarly. I like what you said, Mark, about how sometimes we don't remember until we read the poem and then it all comes back. And that's how I feel. I often forget. I get used to the poem as a poem outside of experience. And then I reread it and I realize I get to re-enter the experience of when it was written, and it all unpacks.
Do any of you have that experience where the initial impulse to write it is sort of not available to you anymore, or it's changed, right? You feel differently about, what you said or what you experienced? Yeah, that happens a lot for me, especially those old love poems,
Yeah.
Did I really say that? Did I really say that?
Yeah, I feel like, I do return to the general frame of mind, but it's not like watching like a home movie of your past. It's like watching like an experimental film of your past, with all of the distortion and, misremembering and all of those things that really hold a poem together almost.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I always feel like poetry is better at describing how life really is than prose, which demands this sort of orderly syntax. I feel like I'm in a vortex and poetry gives that to me, so.
I find that I'm better looking in my poems than I really was.
We have another question here from Sheila. Can you all discuss this volume in the context of the publication of Native literature in the US, and particularly with regard to the Norton and its status among anthologies? Anyone want to take that?
There you go, Gordon.
I'm not
Our scholar here.
I'm not formally part of the panel, so I'll defer to panel members. I'm not a status seeker either, but that's a good question. I know Sheila, so that's a great question. And I get what she's getting at. We've all thought about this for years. Why are there no Norton anthologies of Native poetry, of literature? The way, though, Joy did one that was sort of a Norton anthology at one point. But in this regard, I think, yes, it's groundbreaking for sure. Anybody else will take that on.
Well, it seems like it takes Joy becoming poet laureate to, you know, and then she already had a relationship with Norton, right? As far as her own, you know, her own books and stuff.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it, I mean, it's remarkable to see just in the last 5 years, definitely 10 years. Well, in the last 5 years, several anthologies have come out that are really changing the way that we look at American literature. And one with Hyde Erdrich edited, The New Poets of Native Nations, and that came out from Grey Wolf 2 years ago, I think. Then the one Dean Rader and C. Marie Furman, that one is called, oh, forgive me, it's called Native Voices.
Oh yeah, Native Voices.
Yeah, Native Voices. And that's also a collection of poems by Native poets with some essays attached to them. But we really have, you know, there's so many anthologies that we also drew on in creating this one that are fantastic. But it is significant that this is Norton because of Norton's history of anthologizing. You know, I mean, I remember growing up reading the Norton anthology of like world literature, and I have several copies in my room still from when I was a kid, and it's like this thick, and the poems are written in tiny little print. So there's something psychological about that. But what's unique about this anthology, different from the other anthologies that are out there, and they're all in their own right very important works, is that this one, because of the breadth that we were allowed given the page number, we really could extend several centuries and really include a great range.
Yeah, someone said to me, so it's a Norton, but it's just Native writers. And I said, yeah, like the Norton that was just white writers, you know, that I grew up with.
Yeah.
So, but they never seem to notice that, you know. No. But we also need to plug Hyde Erdrich's new voices of Native poetry or Native nations, is it?
Yeah, there's new. I'll type it in here. New poets.
Yeah. There's sort of some of the newer, I don't want to say younger, but newer Native poets.
Yeah, they were people who published their first book in the first decade of the century. I think that was.
Yeah, I think so. After 2000 or something like that.
And then Native Voices from Tupelo Press. Yeah, so those are two anthologies that came out just in the last few years.
Yeah, and I would also add that one of the great things about the anthology is the range of styles on display too. It doesn't feel like just quote unquote academic writing. It doesn't feel stuck in sort of a coterie of experimental writing. There are all types of poets and all types of approaches represented. And I think that's really, that's one of the most exciting things about it to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sort of want to imagine all the little discussions, polite discussions between all the editors. Because I know it was difficult, you know. I'm not really a person for like awards and, you know, oh, I got in this anthology or I got in this anthology, but this is one that, you know, has meaning for me, I have to say. Probably the only one.
Yeah.
Couple questions in the Q&A, Jennifer.
Oh, I see. Okay, so here's one from Connor. To the panelists, how does English shape your understanding of your native language? That's an interesting question. Anyone? Well, I'll say quickly. I mean, I'm just now learning Mvskoke from my teacher in Oklahoma. I didn't grow up with it. So the more that I learn Mvskoke, the more that I learn about. I really learn about English language too. And since I was military family and I grew up moving around, we lived a lot in Europe and mostly in Austria. So I was able to learn German when I was a kid, which also helped me understand English. So now thinking of, you know, English, German, and when I learned Spanish and now Mvskoke, I'm just so grateful. I'm so grateful for for my teacher and to be learning this language. It teaches me a lot about the world.
Do you speak Cedar?
No, the shoot seed is the language of Suquamish, and it's alive, and we have a dictionary, but I don't speak it. But my sister is, her whole house is right now has these 3x5 cards with the shoot seed words on everything.
Yeah.
Very engaged.
Yeah. Well, I'm sad to say that, you know, when I was a kid on the res, my father was fluent in like 3 different dialects, I guess, you know, Ojibwe and Michif. And so apparently I spoke those all really well when I was a toddler and, you know, learning to speak. And so that's one of my great sadnesses. I mentioned this yesterday, that when we left the reservation, I wasn't able to leave or bring that with me. But when I hear people speak Anishinaabe, Moyen, I go like, wow, that sounds familiar. Like I should know what that means, you know, because it's also familiar in my ear. So mostly to answer that question, actually Connor's a terrific student of mine. What English does is remind me of one more way that I'm lost to my origins a little bit, you know. But of course, on my mother's side, I'm Scots-Irish, so you know, I guess the English is me too, right?
Yeah, I would just like say too that it yeah, English is almost a barrier just because it's like it's hard now to pronounce certain things, to get the way things sound right. But then you also learn like what was important back then, because if you didn't have, or what was around, because if you don't have a word for something, it's because it didn't exist or you didn't need it. And so it's interesting seeing the way like words are created to like sound how they are in English, but to be indigenized, I guess, and that's fun for me.
Anything else?
Last question, or quite long, Jennifer?
Oh yeah, we could do one more question.
Yeah, I think there's one last question.
And the Q&A box, sorry.
Yeah, Q&A.
Okay, I recently learned of Native ancestry that I did not consciously know of, but sensed. Yes, that sounds arrogant to me. I have always written with a sense of another consciousness. Now I'm more self-conscious than ever about having discovered this history and not wanting to be presumptuous about a history that is beyond my experience. So my question is about authenticity. Can you speak to that in regard to what may feel disingenuous but still vaguely familiar? Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I'll jump. I mean, I get similar questions or comments when I'm doing readings out in the world. There's always at least one person who will hang around a little bit till the end of the reading and the Q&A, and usually ask me, you know, away from the microphone. And it's a strange predicament, you know, because I've had elders tell me that, you know, part of being Native is being removed, you know, from where you belong. A lot of us have that story, and it wasn't voluntary removal. I mean, there's been all kinds of formal federal policies about removal, but a lot of us were removed for lots of different reasons, you know. And so it's not unusual. It's not unknown. You know, it's not just a fantasy all the time, but often those strange claims to Native ancestry are based, you know, kind of like Elizabeth Warren, and just somebody in a family claiming it or wanting it to be true. And so then it just becomes true over 2 or 3 generations. And I think that signals that this person asking the question should be cautious. But there's, you know, I would recommend, you know, looking into it, like, you know, where did you find this out? So interrogate your source a little bit, you know, and there might be other sources. One of the things I've discovered about family is that nothing happened until you start asking people about it, you know. So, you know, often our old folks are reticent, to talk about things. So make them tell you stories. Maybe you'll find out some other stuff, or maybe somebody has a real firm, concrete story to offer you on that.
I'll jump in here just for a sec. Thanks for that response, Mark. Anybody else before I say anything? I'm just going to say, I think the last part of what you asked about authenticity is always a slippery, tricky slope to be on. There are things that we do that are probably to some people may seem absolutely authentic. But on the other hand, things that are authentic to our own lives, truthful to our own being and our own way of being, that might not seem authentic to people who are outside looking at authenticity. And I think poetry in some ways gives us an opportunity to really wrestle with being honest with yourself and your own emotions, your own struggles, and to treat that sometimes with a sense that your authenticity is kind of a shifting ground sometimes. You're coming across new experiences, meeting new people that might influence what authenticity might be for you. And so I think it's a really tricky question, and I don't think there's any really hard answer for me. Others may have a very distinct way of doing it. So sometimes what we try to do is we try to explore that in writing. So I had two pieces that I wrote that I think really explore this. One is simple 4-part instructions for creating Indian lit. And in that piece, I just go through all these questions about asking about names, what might be authentic behavior. And the other is in this autobiographical piece I wrote that sort of clears that up too. It's a piece called I is not I in the beginning. And so it just goes through all these ways of thinking about who your relatives are, who you are. And in the end, the answers are, just being comfortable in your own skin in some way. So I hope I didn't go too far with that, but I just wanted to share because it's a tricky question, especially the authenticity part.
Where do we find those poems, those pieces of writing? Or you're muted.
Yeah, Mark. One's in my poetry book, but they're anthologized as well in various places, scattered like most of my poems.
You're referring to the one that has like the list of names that aren't. Yeah, that's amazing. That's hilarious.
I think it's
a fun. I was gonna say it's a fun scavenger hunt. Like if you find yourself, but find Gordon's poems, search for them.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. I think that I appreciate what you say, Gordon, about turning to our writing as a way of exploring not just ourselves but also our questions and our complicities and our what that means.
Right. And using poetry, like whatever you do find out about your family, using that as material in the poetry, like poetry can be an investigation. Like Joy always says, you should be doing research as a poet. So if that research involves your family history, use poetry as a way to get it to move around and become a 3-dimensional space.
Yeah, I mean, often we hear, right, especially brown writers, writers of color that I know, Black, brown, and LGBTQ writers, we often get accused of being identity poets, or identity artists. And my response to that is always like, aren't you writing about your identity? Aren't you expressing your identity when you make your art and your stories? So it's not just us, and it isn't always that we're like trying to find our identity, we're expressing our identity. And sometimes a person's identity is questions about who they are. Like, that's my identity for a while, so that's completely legitimate. I agree with you, Gordon. It's really complex stuff. It's amazing how complex it is. And then you start putting in words like authority, beyond authenticity. Then you get really heavy. But I think our editors had to deal with some of those questions when they did their selections. Joy writes about it. I won't say what it was, so people have to buy the anthology to see what Joy says about it in her introduction.
other questions or comments? Well, I think that's probably at about time. But it's such a rich moment to be able to sit here and talk with all of you. So thank you. And again, thank you, Gordon, for bringing us together.
Yeah, thanks to Gordon and his team. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording, and I just want to say before we do that, this will be available on the MSU English Department website, and link there if you want to look at that recording and hear the reading again for those of you out there, or share it with other people. I really appreciate all of you, all your work. It's inspiring to hear you, and reminds us of the capability and the breadth and richness of the work that you're doing. And it's really been an honor for me to share this space with you. You guys take care of yourselves. And I'm going to stop the recording now.
Miigwech.
All right, now, take care.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.